Hi, I'm Ken Khachigian, and I was the president's chief speechwriter. I was his chief speechwriter in the 1980 campaign. That's where I got to know President Reagan and created a real bond with him. And we had a really great relationship. So that's why he wanted me to come in to help start the administration, do the first inaugural address, and help with all the first speeches, and began what he called the crusade.
Hey, welcome in once again to Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. I'm Bob Frantz. Ken Khachigian is the author of Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Yeah, we're going to talk presidential politics today for an interesting reason. He's also the Director Emeritus of the Richard Nixon Foundation Board of Directors, a veteran of 9 presidential campaigns, and the chief speechwriter and senior political advisor for President Reagan. And of course, with the new Reagan movie being out, it's of more interest now than ever before, I think. He served in the Nixon White House and with President Nixon as he emerged from Watergate. He assisted with Nixon's memoirs and led the preparation for his famous interviews with David Frost. He's a successful attorney. He earned respect as California's premier Republican strategist in elections for governor, senator, and attorney general. He's an honors graduate of UC Santa Barbara, from which he received its Distinguished Alumni Award. Mr. Khachigian is listed among 100 Armenians who have changed the world. How about that? Today we look at relatively recent political history through the eyes of a man who participated in it and compare it to the politics of today right here on Strictly Speaking. Mr. Khachigian, good to have you with us on Strictly Speaking. How are you?
Thanks. I'm just fine, Bob. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. You know, as I mentioned, this is a perfect time to have this conversation. First of all, your book is out, Behind Closed Doors, which is great. But as I mentioned, the movie, Dennis Quaid is playing President Reagan. It's a biographical drama. I don't know what to expect because I quite simply don't have high hopes for Hollywood in terms of accuracy. Do you have any expectations on what you think we're going to see there? Do you plan to see it?
I'm going to see it tomorrow night. There's going to be a sneak preview, so I'll make a judgment tomorrow night. No, I usually don't have high expectations. I was involved in preparation for President Nixon's Frost Nixon interviews. I led the research for that for President Nixon, and it bore no resemblance. The actual Frost Nixon interviews bore no resemblance to the movie by Ron Howard and his and the scriptwriter Peter. I think it was Peter Morgan. I can't remember his. I think that was his name. Anyway, when I complained about the script to the scriptwriter when Ron Howard visited me in my office, and I complained about the accuracy of it, he said, "Well, after all, it's entertainment." So you have to remember, Hollywood wants to entertain, not necessarily present true facts. So we'll make a judgment after I see the movie.
Yeah, and that's obviously smart. That's disappointing. You know, if you are making just an entertainment movie, fine. But if it's supposed to be biographical in nature, the way this one is supposed. Now, I do hear that Dennis Quaid is a true, actual fan of President Reagan. That he is not one of the generally
Right.
speaking far left Hollywood elites and so forth who would be willing to do a hit piece on him. Now, not that he wrote it, but I would have to think that as the star, he might have a little bit of say, and we might see something a little bit more close to reality.
Well, I think I know it was based on a very favorable book on Ronald Reagan, so I think generally it's probably going to be favorable. So, but Hollywood does like to exaggerate and entertain, so we'll just have to wait and see. That we'll have to see what the script looks like, and if they take some words and they take words from certain places and put them in different contexts. So that's how they normally do things, and they'll exaggerate and make it more emotional and dramatic. That's their intention. But then his presidency was dramatic and emotional, and there was a lot of melodrama in it as well. So life imitates art. Maybe art imitates life.
Yeah, and sometimes we don't know which is which, quite frankly. So we'll see what they give
I
us.
never knew it when I was with them sometimes.
Did you know you were making history? Not you. Did you know you were a part of history? You were writing speeches. You were advising President Reagan and President Nixon, even before he was president. Did you know at the time that what you're doing was going to be something that for decades and decades and maybe beyond to come, that what you were doing was going to be that consequential?
I didn't know for sure when I was working with President Nixon. I was young and I could say maybe even callow at certain points, but I was young. But after I'd been spent all that time with President Nixon and the White House, and then in San Clemente, learning so much from him, you can't spend 4 years direct with hours and hours and hours, hundreds of hours, learning at his feet. Like learning at the feet of Socrates almost, without learning all the times he spent over the years in politics. You can't help but learn what history is all about. So by the time I got to working with President Reagan, I knew it was going to be history, which is why I did a tape recorded diary in the 80 campaign. I had a cassette tape recorder. And I, at nights when I wasn't too tired, mostly every night if possible, but every other night, I would record into this tape, a contemporaneous tape account of the campaign. That's why I have 35,000 words of recorded history of the 80 campaign. And that's why there's 6 chapters of the book. And that's why it's so detailed and contemporaneous. And a lot of the history of the 80 campaign is taken out of that diary. And no one else has done an insider's account of the 1980 presidential campaign based on that kind of contemporaneous record. So then, by that time, I got to working with Reagan in the 80 campaign. Yes, I knew I was making history. And when I got to the White House, I knew I was part of something larger than myself.
That is fascinating. And so you did know, and you learned a lot, obviously, as you pointed out from your time in the Nixon White House and even before that. So I want to, I guess we'll go chronologically here and talk a little bit. I saw your speech, by the way. I watched it. It was an hour-long speech that you gave at the Reagan Library, about a month ago, somewhere around there. So I learned a lot about what you talk about in the book, and that's good because it gives me some insights that I really want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into. When we talk about Nixon, young people just hear, oh, he was the president who was impeached and forced to resign. He's, of course, the stain. It's the black sheep of the presidency and
Right.
so on and so forth. I know that from historians. I'm a friend of Hugh Hewitt's, by the way. In fact, I host his show from time to time.
That's
So,
a great guy.
yeah, he is, and I know, of course, his extreme fondness for and his role in the Nixon Foundation and Library and so forth as well. So, I know a little bit more, even though I'm a little bit younger than you are. But tell the younger people who are interested in politics who Richard Nixon really was, rather than the guy who was caught in the Watergate break-in and covering it up and resigning in disgrace, because that's all history seems to record of him, unless you seek out more history. I'm seeking it out now.
Well, he was just an extraordinary historical figure on the American scene and on the international scene. You have to remember he was became vice president of the United States at age 39. And that's after he served in the House of Representatives and then became a U.S. Senator in 1950 and then vice president at age 52 and then for 8 years served under Dwight Eisenhower and traveled the world as a representative of the United States as a very young vice president. Narrowly lost the presidency to Jack Kennedy by the narrowest of margins in 1960, and then lost again for governor. But then made this extraordinary comeback to win the presidency in 1968. So what you learn about President Nixon, Richard Nixon, is his extraordinary resilience in politics, his ability to, his toughness and his strength. And that's because he had learned so much in politics. He studied constantly from the time he entered Congress in 1946 to the time he ascended to the presidency. He studied all the time. He became a student of foreign policy, a student of American politics, and that's why he became a diplomat, a giant in diplomacy, so that he could open the doors to China in 1972. People don't understand that China now is a wholly different country than it was then. People go to China now, and you can find McDonald's, you can find Apple stores, you can go to cafes, and you can drive around in Teslas. But China in the 1960s was a rogue country, like North Korea is today. It was a crazy country. It was a dangerous country to the world that could be explosive. And then Nixon had to offset China and the Soviet Union, which was also a dangerous country with a lot of ballistic missiles. And there were threats to the international order. Nixon entered the presidency facing massive headwinds that nobody can understand today, that they have to look into. The headwinds were China, that was a massive international outlaw, the Soviet Union, that was a massive international threat. They had invaded Afghanistan at the time. And there was that disorder in Vietnam, which he had inherited from the Kennedy and Johnson administrations.
Mm-hmm.
We had 540,000 troops in Vietnam, 500 men being killed every month in Vietnam, with thousands of casualties as well. Now, he inherited that. He didn't start that war. He inherited that war. They talk about as Nixon's war. It was not. It was Kennedy and Johnson's war. He wound the war down. He started de-escalating it the minute he got into office. He had that headwind. The second headwind Nixon had in his presidency was he never had a Republican Congress in the entire 5.5 years he was in the presidency. The Democrats controlled the House and the Senate the entire time he was there. So the fact that he could get anything done, welfare reform, Supreme Court appointments, the fact that he could desegregate the schools in the South, the fact that he could get Title IX passed that liberated women in sports and in other areas, the fact that he could get the EPA done, the fact that he could get black capitalism pushed through, the fact that there were all the other achievements, in fact, ending the war in Vietnam, and doing the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union and the strategic arms limitation talks. All that had to be done against all those headwinds. Plus, the third headwind was an adversarial press. So Richard Nixon had to surmount all these complications and headwinds throughout his presidency. And he did this through this sheer strength and resilience of his inner capacity that he brought to the presidency. So that's the kind of person that people have to understand as they look at the whole man.
I could do just an entire hour on just the follow-up questions that I have from that. We have a lot more things to get into. Let me just focus then and narrow scope on the Vietnam portion of that. How much did you said he wound down Vietnam and ultimately ended Vietnam? Obviously, history records it in a bad way. We lost, essentially.
Right.
We lost 58,000 lives that didn't have to be lost. And you're right, he inherited that war. How much did the policy change when he took over the presidency from Johnson? When he, you say he inherited it and he tried to wind it down. I mean, was there ever any thought of here's what we have to do to make it better? Here's what we have to do to win, to actually beat back communism and drive the North Vietnamese back and so forth? Or was it pretty much a continuation and let's just take our lumps here and get out?
Well, part of the problem he inherited was that Johnson, on the eve of the presidential election in 1968, ordered stopping the bombing of North Vietnam, which when Nixon entered office, that took away from him a massive tool of a military tool from him and his commanders in Vietnam. Also, what Nixon had to do was stop what was surreptitiously done by the communists in Vietnam. They were using secret routes of resupplying their troops in Vietnam. These were the communists. They were resupplying their troops through pathways in Cambodia that were technically off limits to the U.S. And so he was faced with these conundrums, and in order to try to win the war and de-escalate at the same time, he had his hands tied behind his back, trying to stop these resupply of these munitions coming through Cambodia, and B, not being able to have the bombing in the north that was taken away from him by the actions of Johnson, which I think was done in order to help Hubert Humphrey win in 1968. So he wanted to try to force the North to the bargaining table to help the South Vietnamese survive and prevent the communists from taking over. Now, they did get a truce by the end of 1972, and that could have survived. But when Nixon left the presidency and Ford took over, the Democrats who started this war, their State Department did it, all the elite Easterners who began this war, and then who turned on it, they took away, they ceased supplying, providing the military supplies to South Vietnam in 1975. And once all those military supplies got taken away, then the North Vietnamese had no reason to apply to the military, to the truce accords, and just overran South Vietnam. So the war that Nixon had won a truce that the South could have survived was overrun by North Vietnam because the Democrats in Congress took it away.
Well, you mentioned some of the obstacles, including the antagonistic press too, and I think it was in the speech that I watched or somewhere else that I heard you talking about. And I think you mentioned Fox. So,
Right.
if there had been a conservative balance to the press, because back then there were just the three networks and then all of the left-wing newspapers,
Right.
no
Right.
internet or anything else. Had there been a more balance to the press, a Fox of the time or something of that nature, do you think Richard Nixon survives Watergate?
Yes, absolutely. Had had there been a conservative press, had there been social media that we could have tapped into, had there been an outlet, a Fox or a Newsmax, had there been social media sources, uh, had there been blogs, had there been podcasts, had there been other cable sources. But back then we only had three television networks, which were leaned to the left. We had three news weeklies, which leaned to the left. We had the major newspapers, mostly dominated by the New York Times and Washington Post, which
Mhm.
were decidedly to the left and dominated the news cycles. So we didn't have a chance to get our story told in the way we would like to. Had we had the alternative outlets that they're available now, plus had we known then what we know now regarding Watergate, unearthed by my colleague, a Watergate scholar, Jeff Shepard, that there was chicanery and unethical conduct in the special prosecutor's office, where their corrupt judge, Jack Sirica, was meeting secretly with the special prosecutors um, on a number of occasions without defendant counsel involved or President Nixon's counsel involved. We might have had an opportunity to expose that unethical conduct and take that to the floor of the House, and we might have survived.
So you went with President Nixon after Watergate and after he left, and you worked with him. Did in the subsequent years, particularly within the next 2.5 years, it would have been his presidency. Did he ever look at you and say, "Ken, what did I do? I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have resigned." Did he express regret and say, "I should have fought it. I should have stayed with it"? See if they removed me in a Senate trial. Did he ever say, "I did it wrong"?
I, I, I get that asked a lot. You know what? We came after he resigned. I was in the White House, and about 10 days after he resigned, Ron Ziegler, who was his press secretary, had gone out to San Clemente with him. With a small staff, Jack Brennan, the military aide, Diane Sawyer went out with him, and Steve Bull, the personal aide, and they called me and said, he could use some help out here. Can you come out? And I was very loyal, and so I flew out about 10 days after his resignation. And he was desperately in need of help. He was broke. He had no job, obviously. He had no income. He lost his income. He had back taxes to pay because they went after him made claims on his back taxes that I think were unfair. They were trying to disbar him from New York and California, and there were subpoenas floating all over the place. The prosecutors still wanted to indict him. So I sat down with him for the first time as a young 29-year-old aide, and trying to get his finances squared away, trying to put a game plan together for recovery. And so to get to your point, around sort of the long way, to get to your point, he didn't say then or later. What he did say was, Ken, we got to look forward. We can't look back. And I know you said, don't get down. And I was down. I was 29 years old, even though I had all my future in front of me. And he had just lost the most precious thing in his life, the presidency that he'd worked so hard to get. And he had been crushed and let down by friends, people he had campaigned for and helped get into their offices, senators and congressmen who had run for the tall grass at the first smell of gunshot, and had let him down. But he wasn't down. I have to say. I mean, he was unhappy, of course. I mean, he wasn't happy, but he was looking forward already, trying to remake his life. And he told me that, and it was a lesson in life for me about you have to look forward. You have to find a way to renew your life, and that was a really important lesson to me, and something to pass on to people who are watching and listening today. So he didn't say, I should have stuck it out. I should have fought. Yeah, he 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 times he referred to as the damn silly Watergate, and I could have handled things differently and things like that. But he didn't try to replay. He didn't try to rerun the reel all the time. He thought that was useless. It didn't make any sense, and so that's why he remade his life. And when I joined the Reagan campaign, that helped him out a lot because he was able to start contributing to the Reagan campaign, and as we might go forward here, he remade his life, not only assisting Reagan. He wrote 9 best-selling books, traveled the world, and advised foreign leaders, advised President Clinton as well as President Reagan. So that's something for people to think about when the worst things happen in their life. You can either look back and and um, just think about all the worst things that happened to you, or you can look ahead and remake yourself.
Yeah, that's a very inspirational story, and I'm glad to hear it. Um, it's a pretty good transition to Reagan there too. But before we make the full transition to that part of the conversation, you mentioned a bunch of subpoenas. You mentioned going after him for back taxes, trying to do everything they could to crush him, even though he was out of the presidency. Was that the birth of what we now call lawfare?
Um, I don't think there's any question. The birth of lawfare partially took place in the whole in the whole Watergate scenario, with the fact that the Senate Watergate Committee, who started the resolution, who set forth the resolution to set up the Senate Watergate Committee, was Ted Kennedy. Um, he's the one that passed the Senate resolution to start up the Senate Watergate Committee. Now, the reason he didn't chair the committee was because Mike Mansfield feared that it looked too too obvious that Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's brother, put forth the resolution to screw Richard Nixon. So, but he's the one that set up the committee to investigate. They gave it the fancy name, the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, but they might as well call it the Senate Committee to go after Nixon. And they put on that committee, they had 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans, but one of the Republicans, Lowell Weicker, might as well have been a Democrat, and Howard Baker was tried to be nonpartisan. So they stacked it against Nixon there, and then the Special Prosecutor's Office came into being, set up, and Elliot Richardson appointed Archibald Cox, who was the head of opposition research for Jack Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign. And then he brought on as 5 of his top team leaders, people out of Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, all of whom, were anti-Nixon to begin with. And you had more than 30 special prosecutors, all of whom had anti-Nixon views, led by prosecutors out of the Bobby Kennedy Justice Department. I mean, I could go on and on. It's so lawfare.
The lawfare. Yeah, that's the lawfare. But everything else they did after they got him out of there, that was just twisting the knife.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, they were just trying to wreck it.
Yeah, that's right. It's kicking the corpse and trying to burn him when he was down, and it was really bad. It was. You're right. Twisting the knife was just how it was.
Yeah, and that's just such a tragic way, and that's why I'm so glad you have a book like Behind Closed Doors here to kind of talk about your experiences with him and what kind of man he was, in addition to what kind of president he was. And then the other half, of course, of this is President Reagan. And as I mentioned, you've got the book coming out, and President Reagan is remembered a lot differently, obviously, than President Nixon, and with good reason. And first of all, he won the Cold War. We keep seeing the previews for the movie that you're going to see and that we're all going to see later on, the Reagan movie. But you see, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. Communism had been beaten back. The Soviets had essentially been stopped in their tracks. And this is less about Reagan than it is about the whole idea of communism. Is it making its comeback right now in the form of the new China? You just talked about the difference between the China that, Nixon had to deal with and the China of today. But the Chinese Communist Party today, the Vladimir Putin emboldenment, if you will, being emboldened to make that incursion into Ukraine, and in fact a full invasion. Is this the comeback from communism that was beaten back by President Reagan?
I don't think there's any question of that. You see two very. You look at Obama and you look at Clinton. I think Bill Clinton was a little stronger, but you look at Obama and you look at Joe Biden, and you don't see in their hands two great international statesmen. You see them both have weakened the military capacity of America. You don't see them as people who are viewed as great threats by Vladimir Putin or Xi in China. When you go to the negotiating, can you imagine Putin at the negotiating table with Joe Biden or Xi, the negotiating table with Biden, especially in the last 2-3 years, when they knew their intelligence agencies had to know easily that Biden was cognitively impaired, and you don't see also that Biden has a very strong national security or State Department that's really strong. I don't think Blinken is a very strong Secretary of State. I don't think the Defense Department is in very strong hands. So
I think they're terrible. I think they're absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
So you're right about the staff, and about the command leadership, in the State Department and the Pentagon and so forth. How would Reagan have handled this? How would Reagan have handled Vladimir Putin 2 years ago, or 3 years, I guess now, coming into Ukraine? They tried to draw. In fact, they sent Kamala Harris over there. They sent Kamala Harris over there to say, don't do it. Here's a red line, don't cross it. And it's almost like Putin looked at it and said, yeah, right. And away we go. How would Reagan have handled Putin's threat to come into Ukraine? And if he had done it with Reagan at the helm here, what would have happened?
It's hard to say specifically what he would have done. He would have he had strong Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, a very tough guy. Schultz was a strong Secretary of State and could act tough. He wasn't as tough as Cap Weinberger, but I think what Reagan would have sent signals is he probably would have done it through NATO. Is my guess. He would have said, "Look, I'm going to go to NATO and we're going to encircle this and say look, you go there and NATO's going to have a strong response. We're not going to do this just as the U.S., but we're going to stand strong as NATO. And I've already faced, that, I faced on Gorbachev, and uh, where I stand. So I think uh, once you show any weakness at all, the way Biden showed weakness in his withdrawal from Afghanistan, he sent a massive message and signal to Putin and to all the other world leaders who sense when they sense weakness, then they know how to move, and uh, I think it was Lenin who said, probe with bayonets, and if you feel steel, pull back. If you feel mush, push ahead, and that's exactly what they saw with Biden. And when we pulled out of Afghanistan the way he did, they saw mush.
Absolutely. That's a great way to say that. So I want to talk about Reagan as a statesman. You mentioned some of the others being not as great, international statesmen. You were chief speechwriter for one of the most gifted orators in American and maybe world history, quite frankly, when it comes to President Reagan. And I know you've said that President Reagan wrote a lot of his own speeches.
Hmm.
Much of what we have come to know of some of the most iconic speeches ever delivered were his versus yours. I mean, do you ever break it down and say what percentage of what President Reagan delivered to the world came from your typewriter versus what came from his own head? Can you talk about that?
Well, at the end of the day, I tell people what's in the historical record belongs to Ronald Reagan. So the final words belong to him. Uh, it really depends on the occasion. The the greatest speeches he delivered, uh, the final words, he really put his imprint on, such as the first inaugural address, which I gave him. We collaborated on with several meetings, and then once he got a final draft, as long as he had time to work on it, it meant he could edit and re-edit and rewrite. And then on the very important early economic speeches, in February, February 5th and February 18th, where he gave a nationwide speech and then a speech at the joint session of Congress. Those were very important speeches to him. And on those, he took drafts of mine and he edited those very heavily. And on the very important points, those speeches came back in his handwriting. Um, and when we had speeches such as his acceptance speech at the '84 convention or his farewell address at the '88 convention, as long as he had time, he loved speech writing because he did that on the General Electric circuit in the '50s and '60s, early '60s, when he traveled the country because he just loved to write. He told me, he says, even when he didn't write from scratch, he said, in Hollywood, Ken, he said, I wasn't known as a good script writer, but I was known as a pretty good script doctor. And so he said, even though I don't start from the beginning, he says it's always easier to have a draft to begin with. But he loved writing, and he did his when he wasn't governor, he had his radio program, and I think he did a lot of his own writing on that show. So he just loved doing it, and he was a good writer, and he was good at doing imaging, illustrations, and sometimes he came back with stuff that I had to have the fact check people change a little bit and alter a little bit because um, he maybe uh, came back with some exaggerated facts, but nevertheless he loved writing, and so I never try to tell people whose words were which, but he was pretty good at it. There were times when he didn't have time to write something that he was under the gun, that if it wasn't a really major thing, or if after a long time working with him, I got used to getting into his head and getting his style down, maybe he accepted more of what I did than necessary.
Well, you mentioned style. I was going to ask you about that. When you're writing a speech for some, I mean, and by the way, the deep pride you must feel knowing that you wrote speeches for a man who would come to be known by history as the great communicator means you played a massive role in that. That's extraordinary. When you're writing for somebody like Ronald Reagan, who, and I won't embarrass myself by trying to imitate him, I can't do a Reagan voice. I don't even know if Dennis Quaid can do it very well. We'll find out soon enough when that movie comes out. But do you write to his speaking style? He has an eloquence about him and a folksiness at times and a certain thunderous type of delivery at other times. Did you write knowing how he speaks? Did it impact the words you actually put to paper?
I absolutely, and I talk about this in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and I hope people buy the book if nothing else to learn about the speechwriting process, and I wish professors of speechwriting and colleges would buy the book if nothing else to learn about politics, but about public communications and speechwriting, and not just under Reagan, but under Nixon. But under Reagan, it was a process for me to learn. It took me in the campaign of '80, for example. It didn't happen overnight. I had a different style, and I had to work on it. But mainly, it was a matter of paying attention to him, and a lot of the speechwriters who didn't bond with him as well tried to impose upon him their styles, and that was a mistake. I One thing I learned was not to impose my style on him, but to adapt his style and get into his head. So I paid attention to how he worked. But the other person I listened to was the godmother, Mrs. Reagan. She taught me a lot of lessons, and that was on I talk about it in the book. One of the chapters in the book, which is I think is really interesting, is about a long ride we had during a campaign in 1980 on a road trip. We we went to a hog farm in Illinois, and so we had a long ride. It was about 2 hours, and I was in the limo with the then governor and Mrs. Reagan, and I was scrunched up in the jump seat in front of Mrs. Reagan, and he was working on this foreign policy speech, and she was giving me advice, whispering in my ear right behind me. He says, Ronnie, it's important for Ronnie to be emotional in his speeches. And she was giving me a little advice on ideas on how best to work with Ronnie on
Mm-hmm.
his speeches. And I paid attention every time we were on a campaign trail, every time he spoke. And then after a few weeks and towards the end of the campaign in 1980, he and I adapted a style that worked with each other and a cadence. And I learned that he liked illustrations. I saw how he picked up colors in the crowd, and how he made eye contact, and how he would often start sentences by going, well. And so I started writing that into his speeches. And I asked him once what that was all about. And he said, well, that's a stage pause. When I say, well, before I start speaking, that's a stage pause. He learned that in Hollywood. So there was all these little tricks, and I write about that in the book about speech writing. I write about working under stress in campaigns and what that's like, and how difficult it is when you have 40 minutes on working on a plane on final approach, trying to write under stress. You've got a rally coming up, and you've got 40 minutes to write something brand new. And Mrs. Reagan's coming to the back of the plane saying, where's the speech? Ronnie wants to know where his speech is. So there's very interesting anecdotes and stories about what it's like working with the president.
What about his jokes? Legendary for a sense of humor. So many funny stories he would tell. Some of them are firsthand stories you could tell talking with foreign leaders and so forth. Did he write his own material as far as humor, or did you contribute to that?
He had he had a huge storehouse of his own humor, and he would tell those stories all the time, um, and he would sprinkle those stories into his speeches uh, that he came up with. But for the campaign, I'll let you in on a dirty secret. So the campaign in '84, I and I hired a hired a joke writer
Oh,
um, uh, uh, from Bob Hope's joke writer, Doug Gamble, um,
okay.
because the president didn't have time to do all his own jokes. So Doug Gamble would give us 30, 40, 50 one-liners, and we'd insert them into Reagan speeches during the presidential campaign. And then I had another one fellow that I used from time to time. And then when I hired somebody in the presidential staff, Landon Parvin, partly I hired him because he was good at writing humor. So, but Reagan he had his own big file. I don't know where he kept it. He had his own file of jokes, and
He
he
also had
remembered.
his own, he also had his own impeccable sense of timing.
Oh
The
yeah,
way he delivered those. I mean, you could have written the same jokes for a lot of other people and they would have fallen flat. But his timing was, and that maybe that's Hollywood driven as well. But it was amazing.
well, he had a lot of them weren't just jokes. They were jokes, but they were funny anecdotes
Anecdotes. Yep. Yep.
that made his stories better. And often he would use an illustration to make tell the story better. And a lot of those stories I had to try to ask him, had to clarify for him. One of my favorites, if you've got 60 seconds here, was on his speech before a joint session of Congress was he wanted he was so upset about the national debt in 1981. Now the national debt in 1981 was just under $1 trillion. Today, it's approaching $35 trillion.
Right.
It was not quite $1 trillion. It was 985 billion, I think. And he was really annoyed and upset about it. It was going to be $1 trillion, and so he wanted to put something in his speech. And so I wrote the draft, sent it up to Camp David, and he sent that back. And then he had rewritten big portions of it. He called me from the Oval Office when he got back, and he said, "Ken, did you get my edits on the speech?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Could you read my writing?" And I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "There's only one problem." He said, "What's that?" I said, "That's your illustration about your description of how bad the $1 trillion debt is." And that's you wanted to show how bad it was by showing stacking $1,000 bills on top of each other, that it would reach up to the sky like 82 miles to be $1 trillion. And I said, "Sir, where did you come up with that number?" And he says, "Oh, well, by long division." And I said, "Well, I wasn't going to question his ability to divide, but you have to."
It wasn't a bad impression, by the way. Sorry to interrupt the story, but the way you said that you got him down pretty good there. I guess you worked with him long enough. You should be able to.
That's right. But whenever the president uses a fact, it's going to be checked over 1,000 times by the media and everyone else. It goes down in history. So I had to figure out how actually, how high you would stack $1,000 bills before it reached $1 trillion. So guess what? There's always some bureaucrat nerd that knows the answer to something. So we called over to the engraving and mint to get the answer, and it came back. Well, that mean it only the question is whether you want them stacked loosely or you want them bound. So the answer
That's
was 63 miles if they were bound tightly, and 67 if they were stacked loosely. So he was great at that with all those illustrations.
that's fantastic. And what would he think? Anybody want to do the math? Do the long. I wish President Reagan was here to do the long division now for 35 trillion. How high does that go? I mean, truthfully, does it reach the sun for crying out loud? That's an
I have no idea where he came up with that. He probably had been using that on the General Electric circuit or somewhere else in one of his radio speeches. But he was amazing at stuff like that.
well, and to the point of that, policy wise, economic policy wise. Now, I mean, obviously, President Reagan did such a phenomenal job of rescuing us from the Carter years, and what if he were coming in today as a young man? How would he look at $35 trillion and say, "Here's how we tackle that"?
Well,
Well, it's possible.
that's another thing that that we talk about in the book in chapters 13 through 15, where we're talking about his economic plan. It's diversely through the book. He was he was very upset that the American people didn't understand economics, and he didn't mean that to defame the American people, but he thought that he was an economics major in Eureka College, and he thought that the American people didn't understand how the economic system worked in the sense that they didn't have a good feeling for the free enterprise system and for how that you couldn't spend yourself into prosperity and that how these massive budgets of he talked about the war on poverty. He said, Ken, they passed the war on poverty back in the 60s, and guess what? Poverty won. And uh, so he just felt that the system that had been put into place by the opposing party, the Democratic Party, over the years of massive government and more taxes and more spending, it just wasn't working. And so he had a fundamental notion of an economic system that lower taxes and less government and freeing up the people would bring more prosperity, better jobs, a better economy, and a stronger system, and would release the people to release their own energies to create a system which would benefit everybody. And that was his sort of notion of a country that where freedom was spread around to the entire countrywide, and everybody would prosper.
And I want to go back to the speeches for a moment and just about speaking and about speakers. I think, and maybe I'm biased, but I think President Reagan was the most extraordinary orator that I can recall. But there have been some very talented ones, people whose words I may not agree with, but they were really, really good. People like Bill Clinton, for example, and Barack Obama. Who is the best comparison for you for President Reagan in terms of, and it doesn't have to be an American president, but in terms of ability to communicate, to command a room, to have the presence, to be the statesman that you talked about before, not just nationally but internationally? What other individuals would you compare President Reagan to?
Um, well, in terms of commanding a room, well, Richard Nixon is one who could command a room. Winston Churchill,
I know
uh,
you'd say Churchill.
Lady Thatcher could
Okay.
command a room. People like that who had Lady Thatcher, especially, had an ability to command, to have take command and give a real stem winder of a speech. A lot of the British members of Parliament had that capability. A lot of them came up, and through the Oxford Union and in debating societies. But Churchill had that ability to really take command of a room. And but people would be surprised how when Nixon walked into a room, I saw him at the Oxford Union when we traveled there in 1978, and he delivered a speech, and he had them spellbound, delivered without a single note, spoke without a note, and no teleprompters. And by the way, he didn't speak with teleprompters during campaigns at all. Nixon didn't.
Different today. I mean, most of them don't go anywhere without their teleprompters now.
And Reagan didn't use teleprompters. He just spoke from half sheets
Mm-hmm.
on a podium. He didn't use teleprompters either when he campaigned. So those are some of the people I would say.
I'm gonna give you some names of some of like just American leaders, more current and recent history, and give me just a word or two on them as deliverers, speech makers, and just public speakers. Um, Barack Obama was very gifted. I didn't
Yeah,
agree with a lot of his policies, but he was a tremendous. How do
yeah.
you evaluate him, and maybe in comparison to President Reagan?
Well, he's a gifted speaker because he he has a he um, he has the sweep. He sweeps across the room. He's melodramatic, and he has passion. I think it's passion that he delivers, and emotion and passion, and and he's a he looks good on the stage,
Yeah.
and people like that. And he delivers it with passion, and he loves. He brings joy to his message. I think that's what makes him good.
What about Joe Biden? And not necessarily the Biden that we see now and that couldn't speak above a whisper at the presidential debate, but the Joe Biden when he took office, or even back when he was vice president.
I don't think Biden was ever a good, a great communicator. I think Biden's strength was in the Senate, where he was a good old boy, and he was probably really good. He was probably good in Senate debates, where he could uh, uh, talk in a sort of a friendly communication and chit chat on the Senate floor and have banter with his colleagues, but I don't think he could ever. He's probably on a 4 or 5 on a scale of political oratory.
How about Bill Clinton? They called him Slick Willie for a reason.
Yeah, Clinton is gifted because he has Southern charm and he's facile with words, and I think that being facile has a lot to say for it. He has a wonderful smile, just like Reagan does, and I think that goes over well.
And this one is going to be a tough one. Donald J. Trump.
Well, Trump connects with people. That's what got him into the presidency, and he uh, and he has to be careful not to lose that connection, and that's what he has to worry about this year. But in 2016, what brought him into the presidency was that he connected with what Joe Kraft um, called the forgotten man. Joe Kraft was a columnist back in the 60s, and Nixon used that term as well, the forgotten man. And Trump connected with them, uh, and so that the ability to connect is a gift. But if he loses that ability, it's going to be a problem.
Do you know who his chief speechwriter is?
I don't. I understand Stephen Miller does a lot of writing for him, but I don't. I really don't know.
I just wonder, how much they actually work together, because he tends to go off the cuff so much. Even with a prepared speech, he kind of
I
goes.
would never want to be his speechwriter. It's
What,
got to be. Uh,
one more for you on this track. Kamala Harris is the new Democrat nominee. What do you make of her as a speech speaker?
well, she can't. If you take away scripts and teleprompters and everything else, she flunks terribly, and she's lacks any qualification of leadership in that respect. If you prep her and get her ready and glam her up a bit, and she's got a wonderful smile and a great charm, and put a good speech in front of her and craft it well, and she studies it and delivers it well. I think she can charm an audience and do a good job. Beyond that, I think that's her only way of doing it. But outside of that, when she's on her own, she can't do it. She can't extemporize. Reagan could extemporize. Nixon was best at extemporizing. So um, I don't think she's up to that task.
Let me ask you this, Ken. Can a speechwriter of your caliber write for anybody, or do you have to be ideologically in tune? In other words, could you write speeches for Barack Obama or for
Sure,
Joe Biden?
sure.
Yeah, you don't have to share the ideology in order to really kind
Well,
of know.
yeah. I mean, if I mean, I could do it reluctantly. I mean, I did. If if you put a check in front of me and say, here, here's your job today.
You have to do it through devil's advocacy. Okay, here's what I don't believe in, but I'm going to lay it out for you. You can.
Some of my work. I mean, as my job was doing crisis management and corporate communications, I did some of that for. Was not ideological stuff. Yes, you can adapt. Um, I can help people. I can help people communicate in their voices if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, yeah, that is exactly what I'm asking because I think it's amazing how you were able
But
to.
I wouldn't prostitute myself for them. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's I believe that too. So we've got just a few minutes left. I want to go back to Nixon and Reagan. You touched on it very briefly before when I asked about the Fox News thing with Nixon, but I just want to take those guys from their eras, 60s, 70s, and obviously President Reagan into the 80s, and bring them into the internet age, the Twitter and Facebook and Instagram age, and 24/7 news cycle coverage, not just three networks and the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, but 24/7 all over the globe. How does Ronald Reagan do in today's America and that political media environment? How does Richard Nixon do?
Um, they would adapt. Um, they would it would take some time for both of them. I think they would just have to bring people around them. I mean, Nixon adapted in '68 to a whole new regimen. Uh, Things were wholly different for him in '68 than there were in '60. He had to learn how to communicate on television better than he did in '60 and '62, and he adapted. So I think he'd be shrewd enough to um, bring people around him. He brought new people around him in '68 to do precisely that. Uh, Reagan um, in '84, we had a whole new team of people, different than he had in 1980, in terms of using television and the team we had. So I think uh, Reagan especially was um, he's used to being having directors and producers and somebody that he's not just you can't just hey you'll do this and do what we say, but if you sit down and explain to him where we're going and what we want to achieve. Reagan was very capable of adapting to some new regimen. So I think both of them are they were so smart and so bright and so capable they could do it.
I think Reagan would be a rock star in this era. I mean, he's so quick with a turn of phrase. I mean, he would make the short soundbite video clips you see on Twitter and Instagram and so on and so forth. He's already doing it. He's been gone for what? When did he?
Well, we
2004.
did it. Well, we did it in. That's what made it successful in '80 was we reduced everything to inserts and sound bites, and that's how we changed the course of the campaign in '80. And that partly was that was my job, is to change the whole course of the communication when I joined the campaign, and that was the training I brought from my years with Nixon.
Would Nancy micromanage the Twitter feed, the presidential Twitter feed? Do you think?
No, she wouldn't, not unless it was going in the wrong direction. And if it was going in the wrong direction, she'd have her say. She'd have her say uh, if it was Reagan that was concerned. She what when we heard from Mrs. Reagan, it was quite often because there was something that President Reagan had a problem with. If President Reagan had a problem, he didn't. like to transmit it himself. He didn't like that if he was upset with something that I was doing or someone else was doing, he often didn't like to confront us with it. So he often shared that problem with mommy over pillow talk or over the TV trays at dinner time. And so he'd say, yeah, I'm unhappy with this or unhappy with that. And then when we heard her telling us about something or telling me about something, I knew, oh, it's the president that's unhappy. So we have to change course.
Well, that makes perfect
Yeah,
sense.
there's a few stories there's a couple of really good stories in the book about that, and I would hope they'll I would hope they'll go to my website, reaganandnixon.com, www.reaganandnixon.com, and take a look. There's some really fascinating stories in the book if they'll get it.
I'm looking forward to seeing some of those myself. There's the website. We'll throw that up there. We see the book cover over your right shoulder, and we'll splash it up on the screen a few more times as well as reaganandnixon.com. Ken, I really appreciate you taking the time to tell some of these stories, to kind of analyze and break down the history. I've really enjoyed it. I really have it. I know everybody who reads this book is doing it.
There's so many more in the book, Bob. It's just it was just such a wonderful trip and experience, and I hope you'll take it upon yourself to take a look. And the memos that Nixon wrote to Reagan, they're all the secret memos from '80, are all brand new.
Yeah, that relationship between them is very, very important as well.
Yep.
And I've seen a little bit about it. I'm looking forward to that too. You can count on that. Ken, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it. Best of luck to you.
Take care.
There you go. Hey, thanks for watching Strictly Speaking. Don't forget to leave a comment for us. Let us know what you think of this episode and what other episodes you would like to see us. Who do you want us to interview? Don't forget, follow and subscribe wherever it is that you're watching this video so you can be alerted to the next Strictly Speaking. We'll see you next time.